Okay, good morning. So Patricia already talked about the use of the producer's field in benchmarking irrigation use. And now I'll cover the nitrogen part. So my presentation will be focusing on benchmarking on-farm corn nitrogen balance across the western US corn belt. And first, I want to start by showing this figure. This is grabbed from Rosini et al. 2014. And as you can see from this figure, the grain yield is plotted on the y-axis and the nitrogen uptake on the x-axis. And from the relationship, we can see that high-yielding corn has higher nitrogen requirements. For example, for a corn to produce around 13 tons per hectare, which is equivalent to around 207 bushels per acre, it needs to absorb around 179 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And since we know that the indigenous soil nitrogen would not be enough to fully meet the crop nitrogen requirements, producers need to apply supplemental nitrogen, which mostly came from synthetic fertilizer and manure, which we call here as the nitrogen inputs. And now I'm showing the crop nitrogen use, and I have here two conceptual diagrams. First is this nitrogen deficit, which you can see here. It happens when the grain removes more nitrogen than the applied nitrogen inputs. So if this case persists over time, there will be progressive soil mining, which eventually will lead to decline in crop productivity. While this nitrogen surplus happens when the grain removes less than the nitrogen inputs applied by the producer. And this case could lead to high potential nitrogen losses, which we know is detrimental to the environment. So it is very important for producers to find or achieve synchrony between the nitrogen inputs that they're applying and the crop nitrogen requirements for them to have high crop productivity at the same time reduce their potential nitrogen losses. And one good indicator of the potential nitrogen losses to the environment is this nitrogen approach in corn. So for this approach, we have this assumption that the indigenous nitrogen is in steady state, which is mostly the case of the soil here across the US corn belt. So with this assumption, we could estimate the nitrogen balance as the difference between all of these nitrogen inputs and the grain nitrogen removal. But we further simplify this approach because we want to estimate the nitrogen balance in producer's field. So we would just want to include nitrogen inputs parameters that are readily available in a producer's field, meaning producers should have a direct way of measuring them every growing season. So for example, here, the nitrogen from manure, we have excluded this nitrogen manure as part of our nitrogen inputs because we know that nitrogen from manure, there will be a difficulty in quantifying the amount that producers are applying and also the amount or the time of nitrogen release from manure. So we have excluded this nitrogen from manure, and from our area of study, producers, around 5% of producers applied manure, so have excluded those fields that applied manure. The same case for nitrogen from deposition. So for Nebraska at least, this just accounts for around 7% of the total nitrogen inputs. So we have excluded this nitrogen from deposition also. So with that, our nitrogen balance could be estimated as the difference between these nitrogen inputs coming from fertilizer and irrigation minus the grain nitrogen removal. And from their difference, we can see that this nitrogen balance approach is corn is a good indicator of potential nitrogen losses to the environment. And now let's talk about the nitrogen losses scaled by yield. So this yield scale nitrogen losses is basically just the ratio between the nitrogen losses and the actual yield. So I plotted the yield scale nitrogen losses on the y-axis and the nitrogen balance on the x-axis. And again, those producers that have less than zero nitrogen balance will experience nitrogen deficit or soil mining, while those above zero nitrogen balance are producers that will exhibit nitrogen surplus or the potential environmental losses. From the relationship, we can see that the nitrogen losses did not change, mostly in the nitrogen deficit part, but the nitrogen losses started to linearly increase at this certain point of nitrogen surplus. And from these references, this point is equivalent to around 75 kilograms per hectare or 67 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So we have used this value as a threshold to separate those farmers that are exhibiting large versus small nitrogen balance. And could we also develop a conceptual framework to benchmark nitrogen balance? So this is basically the same as what Patricio has shown for irrigation, but as you can see here, the relative yield is again plotted on the y-axis. This was explained by Patricio, so relative yield is basically just the ratio between the actual yield and the yield potential. So the higher this value is, the better the productivity of the producers. So I'm showing here again the threshold that I've shown earlier, which is 67 for nitrogen balance. And of course, I also assign a threshold for relative yield, which is around 80% of relative yield for irrigated fields and a little lower for irrigation for rain-fed fields, to account for the erratic precipitation or the higher production risk for rain-fed as compared to irrigated fields. So once these thresholds were assigned, we can then group also those fields into 4 categories. And like what Patricio has said, our main goal is always for producers to fall in this category A. So the main goal is always to simultaneously achieve high yield and at the same time exhibit small positive nitrogen balance. So that would be category A here. And the worst scenario again here is those fields that fell in category B. So those are the fields that have large or ample room for improvement. They could probably increase their yield or reduce their nitrogen balance by some agronomic management practices. So as you can see here, this is a very good framework for producers to assess their performance in terms of their yield and nitrogen use, and they can further use this to find opportunities to maybe increase their yield at same amount of nitrogen balance, or reduce their nitrogen balance without hurting yield or even increasing yield, and both. They could increase their yield at the same time reduce their nitrogen balance. So the objective of this presentation is to benchmark on-farm corn yield and nitrogen balance, and we used here different nitrogen metrics related to yield and nitrogen losses across irrigated and rain-fed fields here in Nebraska. In addition to nitrogen balance metric, we also used here the partial factor productivity for nitrogen input, which is the ratio between yield and nitrogen input, and this yield scale nitrogen balance, which is the ratio between nitrogen balance and yield. So we have used combination of this metric to have better assessment of the yield and potential nitrogen losses in producers' fields. And all of you are familiar with this Nebraska map, which is divided into 23 natural resource districts or NRDs. So the result of this analysis have used the data from the data that was shared by each of these NRDs. So we would just want to thank you for sharing all those data, and now I think it's our turn to return those data to you and show to you the value of each of those producers' data that you have shared to us. Each color here is a climate soil domain, meaning those region that has the same color has similar climate and soil type, which you would expect the crop to have a similar response. So for this analysis, I just used two major climate soil domain here, which was highlighted there. And this covers around 1.3 million hectare of US maize harvested area. So here you can see I've used data from Tri-Basin, Lower Platte North, Little Blue, and Upper Big Blue. So I think most of your fields, you could see it from the data that I'll be showing later. When I zoom those two climate soil domain, you can see the location of each of those irrigated fields, shown in blue, and also the rainfed fields, shown in red. This first climate soil domain only has irrigated fields, so I call it as 1I. I stands for irrigated, while the second climate soil domain both has irrigated and rainfed, hence the 2I and 2R. And all in all, for this analysis, I've used around 9,300 field years that were collected between 2009 to 2015. And just to show here the distribution of producer yield and nitrogen inputs, we can see here that first, the yield, average yield was shown by these blue lines here. If we compare these two, this is rain-fed on the upper panels and rain-fed on the lower panels, you can see that, of course, irrigated field has much higher yield compared to rain-feds and also much higher nitrogen inputs applied compared to rain-fed fields. We saw here that the average yield in Nebraska are already high. It's around, for irrigated fields, it's around 81% already of the yield potential, while for rain-fed, it's around 70% of the water-limited yield potential. And what we can see here also is this yield, rain-fed yield has much higher variation. So you can see by this wide range here compared to irrigated fields. And this is again due to the erratic precipitation across years in which rain-fed field yields were affected as compared to irrigated fields. Another thing that I'm showing here is this small inset here, which shows the amount of nitrogen from fertilizer and irrigation. And we can see here that the nitrogen from irrigation is around 11% of the total nitrogen inputs applied for irrigated fields. And now you can remember the nitrogen balance framework that I showed earlier. So again, the relative yield is plotted on the y-axis and the nitrogen balance on the x-axis. And for now, I'll be showing the result for each of the domain. Okay. So here, I think this domain 1I corresponds to most of the fields in Tri-Basin, while this in domain 2I and 2R mostly compose the fields from Upper Big Blue, Little Blue, and Lower Platte North. And now I'll be populating each of these conceptual framework with the data that we have collected, so you can see here. And what we can see is the same as, I think, the conclusion that Patricia has made for the irrigation use. For example, you can see here that there are around 25% of fields, 23 to 25% of irrigated fields, and around 44% of rainfed fields that fell in category A, which again, our main goal. Those are the fields that attain high yield at the same time exhibit small positive nitrogen balance. So we can conclude here that, okay, achieving high yield at the same time exhibiting small positive nitrogen balance is a realistic goal. It's not a conflicting goal as what we could see from these farmers that are attaining that main goal. And also we can see here that there are still large room for improvement. There are around around 60–70% of farmers that fall in category C and D, which are the farmers that are attaining large nitrogen balance, especially for irrigated fields. So there are large room for them to improve or reduce their nitrogen to reduce the nitrogen balance. For example, those fields in category B, they could find management practices that could help them to increase their yield at the same amount of nitrogen balance. Or those in category D could also move to category A That means that they could reduce their nitrogen balance without hurting their yield. And also, those fields in category D, they could either increase their yield or they could reduce their nitrogen balance or do both. And another thing that I'm showing here is the effect of the water regime and the previous crop for yield. I'm showing here the yield, nitrogen fertilizer, and nitrogen inputs, and the three metrics that I discussed earlier. So I have here the nitrogen balance, the partial factor productivity for nitrogen, and the yield scale nitrogen balance. I'm showing here the result for irrigated, shown by these left two bars here, versus the rain-fed, shown by these right two bars here. And I further categorize the irrigated and rain-fed fields based on their previous crop, is what you can see here. So this yellow colored bar here is a maize field that were sown after continuous corn field, while this green bar here is a corn field that were sown after soybean. First, I want to compare here the performance of irrigated versus rain-fed fields. What we can see that, okay, rain-fed fields has higher yield, but it also applied higher nitrogen fertilizer and higher nitrogen inputs compared to rain-fed fields. And of course, it also exhibited higher nitrogen balance compared to rain-fed fields and almost similar partial factor productivity. But what's most interesting here is this yield scale nitrogen balance, which again is the ratio between this nitrogen balance and yield. We can see here that rain-fed fields has much higher and more variable, as you can see by this whisker here. It has much higher and more variable yield scale nitrogen balance as compared to irrigated fields. So result from this figure shows that these irrigated fields would probably need an extra or additional cropland for them to have the same production goal as the irrigated fields, which will result eventually to, if not higher, probably the same nitrogen balance as compared to irrigated fields. And another thing that I checked here is this irrigated corn after soybean, this highlighted in blue here. And I want to compare that with the rain-fed fields. So we can see here that this irrigated corn planted after soybean applied much higher nitrogen fertilizer and much higher nitrogen inputs compared to the rain-fed fields. And it also exhibited higher nitrogen balance compared to rain-fed fields. But if we will compare their yield, this irrigated corn after soybean has much higher and stable yield as compared to rain-fed fields, and almost similar partial factor productivity. And again, this irrigated corn after soybean has much lower and much more stable yield scale nitrogen balance if you compare them to the rain-fed fields. So this means that this corn-soybean rotation is probably one good management practices that could potentially help producers to reduce their nitrogen balance while attaining higher yields or even increasing their yield. And I'm showing here also this dashboard here. So this is a web portal or a dashboard that our group currently have for development. And I'll be showing how this dashboard could be of a great use for NRD managers and also for producers. And here I want to start first how this could be of, how could NRD managers could make good use of this dashboard that our group have developed. So if I am an NRD manager and I log into this dashboard, this is the portal that they can see. So each point here is the fields within their NRD. For example, here I'm showing the result of all the fields for these specific NRDs. And they could also pick whatever the crop type is. For example, they could pick only the fields that sown corn or that sown soybean, and also they could pick the water regime. They could change it to fields that were irrigated or fields that were raven. For now, I'm showing here the irrigated corn fields in this specific NRD in Nebraska. And what I'm showing here is the heat map for nitrogen use, but our dashboard also has data for producers' yield, producers' water use, and also the efficiency in terms of their water and nitrogen use. So those fields here that were shown in a dark red color are the fields that are not really doing that good, meaning they are those fields that are applying much higher fertilizer as compared to the other fields within those same NRDs. So if I'm an NRD producer, probably this could be of main use to me by identifying all those fields that have high nitrogen inputs, or those fields in a dark red color, and maybe have a one-on-one meeting with them to help them find ways on how they could probably improve their performance by identifying management practices that could help them to potentially reduce their nitrogen losses. One thing that we can see here also is this highlighted here in, it's not that clear, but you can see here you could pick any dates that would show you a different heat maps. Right now I'm picking 2015 as you can see here, but I think this right now range between 2004 to 2015. So our dashboard will show you the heat maps ranging from 2004 to 2015. So this could be used by NRD producers to check the impact of their new technologies, or for example, if they have these new technologies that they've instituted maybe 3 or 4 years ago, they could check these heat maps and see how those technologies have impact by seeing if this heat map will change and if this could reduce those fields with that shown in that bright red, or those fields with high nitrogen use. And also, there's also a dashboard that we've made specifically for the producer's use. So if a producer log in, you will see this dashboard, and you can click here your specific fields. So right now, I'm showing here the performance of this specific field, which you could see from this pop-up bar here, different circles. So this shows their performance in terms of their nitrogen use, in terms of their yield, their water use efficiency, and the nitrogen use efficiency. There's also here a button where they can select if they want to compare their fields against those fields located in the similar climate and soil domain, or maybe they want to compare against the fields located in the same NRD or against the same county. The color corresponds, or it's the same as the traffic lights color. So the green means that you're doing good, the red is bad, and the orange is you're in the middle. So for example, your score is 100, that means that you are doing good in terms of these parameters, and if it is 0, it means that there's a large room for improvement. So let's check, for example, this score for nitrogen use of these specific producers. This is showing 36%. So we could interpret this that these producers are applying less nitrogen per acre compared to 36% of producers within the same climate soil domain. Or we could say the other way around. These producers are applying more nitrogen per acre compared to 64% of the producers within that same climate soil domain. And if you click on this circle here on nitrogen, it will give you these bars here, which could show you the specific amount of the applied nitrogen use. So selected is your field. So this is where you are in terms of your nitrogen application. And shown in green is the most efficient farmers, or the farmers that are on the top 25% of the distribution. The efficient are the average farmers, and these less efficient are the farmers on the bottom 25% of the nitrogen use distribution. And by this you can compare that efficient farmers are applying around 175 pounds of nitrogen per acre, while you are applying more than 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So you are not being very efficient, so you could use this to assess your performance and compare your performance against other fields within the same climate soil domain, or within the same NRDs, or within the same county, and maybe find producers, NRD managers, extension educators could work together and find opportunities for those fields that are not doing really great to help them improve their yield or reduce their nitrogen balance, or increase their efficiency. I think that's it. So what did you learn from this presentation? So the conceptual framework for nitrogen balance showed us that achieving high yield and exhibiting small positive nitrogen balance is a realistic goal, as shown by those fields that fell within the category A of the nitrogen balance framework. And it also showed us that there is still ample room for improvement. Many producers could still reduce their nitrogen balance without hurting yield or even increasing their yield by just adjustment of some agronomic management practices. And this corn in rotation with soybean showed us that it could help producers to increase their yield and lower their nitrogen balance. In addition, this nitrogen balance framework showed us that it could help producers to assess their performance and to identify possible practices for improvements. And further, it could be an effective prioritization, extension prioritization, to help the NRD managers or other policymakers to identify those fields that has large room for improvement and maybe focus on those fields. For example, those fields that fell in category D of the nitrogen balance framework.
I just want to make a comment here that I forgot, and is that all this information is confidential. So nobody knows which field belongs to who, or who is managing that piece of land. All the data is written confidentially, and we, as you can see, we are interested on the overall analysis rather than pinpointing at one specific field. So we treat the data with a strict confidentiality, and we don't share any data with third parties. This is data that was provided by farmers from Nebraska, and data that we're trying to use for the benefit of the farmers of Nebraska. So that's an important message that I want to give. But it's also interesting how it is possible to come up with so much information based on your own data, which I believe has much power and is way more meaningful than any small backyard experiment that I may run in my campus. So again, thank you very much for the data that you have been providing through NRDs all these years.